The stadium was filled with noise. Thousands of voices mixed together, carrying songs, chants, and endless emotions. But in the middle of all this sound, a strange, quiet moment was about to arrive. People had come from every corner of India and Pakistan to watch this great match. Cameras moved quickly, focusing on players, coaches, and the leaders who were sitting near the pitch. No one knew that what would happen in the next few minutes would stay in memory longer than any goal or any victory. The game had just finished its first half. Both sides had played with intensity. Players were sweating, falling, rising again, showing strength that inspired the crowd. But behind the game, there was also something heavier. Tension always lived between these two nations. Every time their players met, they carried more than a ball and a jersey. They carried history, pride, and emotions of millions. Many feared the rivalry, but many also hoped that maybe one day, something could change. As players walked toward the benches for a short break, the stadium screens suddenly focused on two men sitting quietly in the stands. On one side was Prime Minister Modi, watching with folded hands resting on his lap. Beside him, in another row but clearly visible, was Sundar Pichai, the CEO who had flown in only to support both teams. The cameras expected claps or smiles. Instead, the world saw something different. Both men were silent. No words, no gestures, just silence. At first, the crowd did not understand. Why were they silent when the game was so loud? Why were they not cheering like the rest? But slowly, that silence began to spread. People noticed Modi looking down with calm eyes as if he carried the weight of the entire stadium in his chest. People noticed Pichai keeping his face humble, showing neither victory nor defeat, only deep respect for what was happening on the ground. That silence touched something hidden inside the audience. It was not weakness. It was not disinterest. It was respect. Respect for the game, for the players, and for the effort from both sides. In a place where cheers often turned into anger, the silence of these two men felt like a shield against hate. The players noticed it too. A young Indian batsman, wiping sweat from his forehead, looked toward the stands and saw Modi's stillness. He whispered to a teammate, "Look, even he is quiet. Maybe we should feel this moment." On the other side, a Pakistani bowler tied his shoelaces and lifted his head. He saw Pichai's soft expression, almost like a prayer without words. It gave him strength and it calmed his heart. Suddenly, the crowd's chants slowed down. Not all, but enough for everyone to feel a difference. It was as if an invisible thread connected leaders, players, and spectators. A thread built not from sound, but from silence. The commentators on television struggled to explain. One said, "This is unusual, friends. Never have I seen such a moment in India versus Pakistan games." Another whispered, "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." Deep inside, both Modi and Pichai were thinking the same thought. They knew that politics, business, and power often divided people. But here, inside a stadium filled with hope and fear, silence could be more powerful than speeches. Silence was neutral. Silence respected every flag and every jersey. Silence made everyone equal for a few seconds, and then something unexpected happened. A small child in the crowd stood up holding flags of both nations. The child raised them high without shouting a word. The cameras caught that image, and it appeared on the big screen. People gasped. Silence continued. It was not planned, not organized. It was pure, like a heart opening itself in front of the world. In that moment, India and Pakistan players both felt the same weight on their shoulders. They realized this game was not about breaking each other. It was about showing the best of themselves. It was about reminding the crowd that rivalry should never kill respect. When the break ended, the referee blew the whistle again. But the energy on the field had changed. The players' eyes carried something softer, something stronger. The match was still fierce, but inside that fierceness lived a new respect. And in the crowd, many whispered to each other about what they had just seen. They would later forget who scored or who missed. But they would never forget the silence of Modi and Pichai and how it touched the hearts of India and Pakistan players. This was only the beginning. None of them knew that this silence would travel far, across cities, across borders, and change lives in ways no one had imagined. The whistle of the referee cut through the heavy air and the players returned to the field. But something inside the stadium had shifted. People could not explain it in words. yet they felt it in their bones. A few minutes ago, the stadium was like fire. Songs, chants, whistles, and drums filled every corner. Now, even though the sound returned, it was softer, less harsh, almost as if people were afraid to break the spell that silence had created. On the field, the Indian captain adjusted his gloves and looked across at the Pakistani batsman standing at the crease. Normally, his eyes would carry only focus, sometimes even hostility, because rivalry ran deep in their blood. But today, his gaze carried something new, an understanding that they were not just two men from two nations. They were symbols in front of millions. He remembered the way Modi sat still, his head slightly bowed, not in defeat, not in arrogance, but in deep respect. That image stayed with him. He realized that every move he made now carried a different meaning. The Pakistani batsman also felt it. He had played many matches before, but none had felt like this. As he held his bat tighter, he remembered Sundar Pichai's quiet expression. A man who could have chosen to show pride for one side, yet instead chose humility. That choice carried weight, more than any business deal or speech. The batsman whispered to himself, "Play not just for victory, play for respect." The crowd noticed the change in energy. When the Indian bowler ran in for the next delivery, cheers rose again, but they were not angry. They were encouraging. When the Pakistani batsman defended the ball with calm strength, applause came even from those in the opposite section. It was a small miracle. For once, the sound of the game was not about division, but about recognition of human effort. Inside the stands, Modi's silence was not empty. In his heart, he was replaying memories from his youth. He remembered how he once sold tea near a railway station, how he watched travelers of every background pass by, carrying hopes and struggles. He thought of the people of India who wanted peace, who wanted their children to live without fear of rivalry. He knew his silence was not weakness. It was a prayer, a statement that sometimes restraint speaks louder than command. Beside him, Sundar Pichai thought of his own journey. He thought of his childhood in Chennai, the small home where his family shared one room, the times when his father saved money just to buy a simple household device. He thought of how far he had come, yet how humble his roots remained. Looking at the players, he felt that same humility. He knew that technology, money, or power could never replace the raw human spirit he saw on the field. His silence was his way of saying, "I am not bigger than this moment. This moment belongs to the people." And then came a twist no one expected. During the over, the Pakistani batsman tried to take a quick run. The Indian fielder threw the ball fast, and it struck the batsman's leg. He fell hard to the ground. The stadium gasped. For a moment, fear returned, fear that the fall would spark anger, that the old fire of rivalry would return. Players rushed to him. Some Indian players stopped their game faces and reached down to help. One placed his hand gently on the batsman's shoulder. The crowd held its breath, and then something rare happened. The Indian captain, who was usually fierce, knelt beside the injured batsman. He removed his own water bottle and offered it. The Pakistani player looked up, surprised, but then smiled weakly and accepted. Cameras captured the image, and within seconds it was broadcast across television screens into homes across both countries. Millions of people saw it. This was not just a game anymore. This was a message. Respect could exist even inside rivalry. Compassion could exist even inside competition. And silence, yes, silence, had created the space for this kindness to show itself. If Modi and Pichai had cheered, if they had shouted for one side, perhaps the players would have felt pressure to carry anger. But their quietness had allowed something else to grow. As the injured batsman stood again with help, applause erupted. This time it was not just from one side of the stadium. It was from everyone. Men, women, children, elders, all clapped together. Even those who came with flags ready to shout slogans now clapped with tears in their eyes. They were seeing something they had never seen before. The commentators' voices cracked with emotion. One said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you are not just watching cricket today. You are watching history. You are watching hearts opening." The other replied, "Look at the players. Look at the leaders. Look at the crowd." Silence has turned into respect. Respect has turned into kindness. Inside his heart, the injured batsman thought of his little daughter watching from home. He knew she would see the image of him being helped by an opponent. He whispered in his heart, "Let her learn that life is bigger than rivalry." And in the stands, Modi and Pichai exchanged a glance. No words were spoken, but the glance carried a world of meaning. It was a quiet agreement that leadership is not always about speeches, but sometimes about what you refuse to say. It was an understanding that humility could break walls faster than pride. As the match continued, the energy became something completely new. People were still cheering, but now they were cheering for effort, not for hatred. They were cheering for courage, not for rivalry. Every ball, every run, every dive, every save was met with applause from both sides. No one in the stadium realized it, but the moment was already being shared across phones, across social media, across television screens. Millions outside the stadium were beginning to watch the silence of Modi and Pichai, the kindness of the players, and the reaction of the crowd. The echo of this moment had begun to travel far beyond the boundary of the field. The second half of the match was not just about who would win. It was about who would rise higher in spirit. And for the first time in many years, India and Pakistan fans found themselves clapping together as if their hands were no longer divided by borders. The second half of the match began with a rhythm that no one had expected. Usually, when India and Pakistan faced each other, the game was tense, full of shouts, and every small mistake became a chance for anger. But now the silence of the leaders and the respect shown by the players had shifted the entire atmosphere. It was as if the game had been reborn, carrying not just competition, but a shared spirit. Every run was cheered not with anger, but with encouragement. When the Indian bowler delivered a perfect Yorker, the crowd erupted in applause. Even some Pakistani fans nodded in respect. When the Pakistani batsman struck a clean shot to the boundary, Indian fans stood up and clapped too. It was unusual, strange, almost magical, and yet it felt natural, as if people had been waiting for this change for years without realizing it. Deep inside, the players felt lighter. For the first time, they could play without the heavy weight of rivalry pressing on their backs. They could focus on their game, on the craft they had practiced since childhood, without worrying about being seen as enemies. Some even exchanged smiles on the field. One Indian fielder joked quietly to the Pakistani batsman after saving a boundary, and for a second, both laughed. The cameras caught it, and millions watching at home were stunned. Was this really happening in an India versus Pakistan match? In the stands, Modi remained still, but inside his mind, thoughts were flooding. He remembered the times he had met soldiers' families, the weight of grief in mothers' eyes, the silence of fathers who had lost their sons. He knew rivalry had always carried pain, but here, in this moment, he saw a small door opening. He thought, if players can smile together, if crowds can clap together, why can't nations learn from this silence? His silence grew heavier, but also more hopeful. Sundar Pichai was also lost in reflection. He thought about technology, about how millions used phones and screens every day to argue, to divide, to spread anger. But he also thought about how this very moment, the silence, the smiles, the respect, was being shared across those same screens, changing hearts in real time. He whispered in his mind, "Let this go viral not as noise, but as hope." And then came another turning point. The game had reached a tense moment. The scores were close, and both sides needed courage. The stadium was waiting for someone to step up. Suddenly, a young Indian bowler playing his very first big match was given the ball. He was nervous, his hands shaking slightly. The pressure of the situation could have broken him. But then he looked up. His eyes traveled to the stands, to the silent face of Modi and the calm expression of Pichai. He remembered the image of the Indian captain helping the injured Pakistani batsman. He remembered the crowd clapping together, and in that memory, his fear melted. He told himself, "I am not carrying hatred, I am carrying hope." He ran in with full focus and delivered his first ball. It was fast, straight, and perfect. The batsman tried to strike but missed. The crowd roared in excitement. The young bowler felt something ignite inside him. The next delivery was even better, hitting the stumps. The batsman was out. For a second, both sides of the stadium erupted together, not in anger, but in pure appreciation of skill. The young bowler raised his hands, not in arrogance, but in gratitude. He whispered, Thank you. Silence. But the story did not stop there. The next batsman from Pakistan walked in, tall and experienced, known for his calm presence. As he adjusted his gloves, he looked at the young Indian bowler and gave a small nod of respect. The bowler nodded back. It was not just a gesture. It was an agreement between two opponents that this game was bigger than them, bigger than rivalry. Commentators struggled to find words. One said, "Dear viewers, I don't think we are watching only cricket today. We are watching a lesson for life. We are watching respect rise where there was once division." Another added, "This silence of Modi and Pichai has turned into something powerful. It has changed the mood of the stadium and maybe even the heart of the region." Families at home felt the same. In villages of Punjab, in towns of Sindh, in cities like Delhi, Lahore, Karachi, and Mumbai, people sat glued to their screens. Fathers who once shouted harshly during these games sat in quiet awe. Mothers whispered prayers of peace. Children pointed at the TV saying, "Look, they are clapping together." And then an extraordinary moment arrived. During a crucial over, the Pakistani batsman struck a shot high into the air. It looked like it might go for 6, but an Indian fielder sprinted with all his strength and caught it just at the edge. The stadium gasped. Normally, such a moment would bring screams of triumph from one side and anger from the other. But this time the crowd stood together and clapped. Yes, one side lost a wicket, but both sides respected the effort, the dive, the courage, the skill. The Pakistani batsman who was out walked back slowly. But as he reached the halfway point, something surprising happened. The Indian crowd stood up and applauded him. He turned back, stunned, and then raised his bat in gratitude. It was a gesture rarely seen in matches between these nations. The camera zoomed in on his eyes. There were tears. He whispered, "This is more than cricket." In that moment, silence had turned into unity, and both Modi and Pichai, though they remained quiet, carried smiles hidden in their eyes. They knew something was happening that words could not create, something that speeches could never force. This was the language of humanity. The game continued, but people no longer cared only about who would win. They cared about what they were feeling, what they were seeing, what they would remember for the rest of their lives. The match entered its final stretch. The tension was real, but it was not the kind of tension that bred anger or hatred. It was the kind of tension that made every heartbeat louder, every clap heavier, every breath longer. Both India and Pakistan had fought hard, and now only a few overs separated them from the final result. Yet, strangely, no one in the stadium was thinking only about the score. They were thinking about the journey that had unfolded before their eyes, the silence of leaders, the kindness of opponents, and the unity of the crowd. In the commentary box, the voices of experts trembled with emotion. One said, "I have seen dozens of India versus Pakistan matches, but never like this. Something sacred has entered the game today. It feels less like sport and more like a lesson written in front of us." Another commentator added softly, "Silence, respect, kindness, these are the real players tonight." On the pitch, the young Indian bowler who had taken a crucial wicket stood ready again. His eyes were not filled with fear anymore. He felt as though millions of invisible hands were supporting him, not just Indian fans, but also Pakistani families who admired his courage. He whispered under his breath, "I will give my best, and let respect do the rest." The Pakistani batsman at the crease was one of the most senior players of his team. He had carried the hopes of his nation many times before. Normally, his focus would be sharp and his heart heavy, knowing how much pressure rivalry brought. But tonight he felt different. He looked at the bowler and thought, "This young man is not my enemy. He is my mirror, carrying the same dreams, the same weight." For a moment, it felt like two human beings were standing in front of each other, not two opponents. The bowler ran in and released the ball. The batsman struck it with precision, sending it rolling toward the boundary. The crowd exploded in cheers. But this time, the cheers were mixed. Indian fans clapped for the bowler's courage. Pakistani fans cheered for the batsman's skill, and many cheered simply for the beauty of the game. The noise was powerful, but underneath it lived the same silence that had begun everything, the silence of respect. As the game moved closer to its end, the scoreboard showed how close the match truly was. Every run mattered. Every mistake could change the result. The pressure on both teams was immense. But then something extraordinary happened once again. An Indian fielder misjudged a ball and fell awkwardly. The Pakistani batsmen could have run for extra runs, but one of them stopped halfway, signaling the umpire to check on the injured player first. It was an act of kindness that sent shockwaves through the stadium. People stood on their feet, clapping with tears in their eyes. Even Modi, still silent, placed his hands together in a small namaste, acknowledging the moment. Pichai closed his eyes for a second as if to seal the image into his memory forever. It was proof that compassion had the power to override rivalry, even in the middle of battle. The Indian player rose slowly, touched by the gesture. He smiled at the Pakistani batsman and gave him a small pat on the back. It was a simple exchange, but millions watching around the world felt it like a lightning bolt in their hearts. Families sitting in front of televisions whispered, "This is what we always wanted to see." As the overs ticked away, both sides played with all their strength. Boundaries were hit, wickets were taken, catches were attempted with full dives. But the spirit had changed. Every success was celebrated, every failure respected. Even when a player made a mistake, the crowd encouraged instead of mocking. It was as if the entire stadium had grown into one family. And in that family, silence still ruled. Whenever the camera returned to Modi and Pichai, their calm presence reminded everyone of the foundation that had created this transformation. No grand speech, no loud slogan, only silence. Silence that carried humility, silence that carried resilience, silence that carried kindness. Outside the stadium, the effect was spreading faster than anyone expected. On social media, clips of the players helping each other, of crowds clapping together, of the leaders sitting in stillness, were being shared millions of times. Hashtags of peace and unity began to trend. People who had never spoken kindly about the other side found themselves writing, "Today, I respect them." News anchors, who usually raised their voices in heated debates, spoke in softer tones, almost humbled by what they were witnessing. Inside homes, children asked their parents questions. Why are we always told they are our enemies, when on the field they look like our brothers? Parents struggled to answer, their eyes moist. They realized their children were seeing something pure, something unfiltered, something more honest than years of speeches or headlines. Back in the stadium, the final overs were beginning. Sweat dripped down the players' faces, but in their eyes there was fire mixed with gentleness. No matter who won, they knew this night was already bigger than a trophy. They were part of a story that would be told for years. The stadium was alive with energy, yet underneath it all there was an invisible calm. The scoreboard told one story. Both sides were almost equal, every run critical, every ball holding the weight of destiny. But the faces in the crowd told another story. The faces were not twisted with anger or rivalry. They were softened by something gentler, something rare. They were softened by the memory of silence, by the respect that had been born in the middle of noise. With only a few overs left, the Pakistani team needed just under 20 runs. It was difficult, but not impossible. The Indian players knew one mistake could cost them the match, but instead of fear, they carried a strange sense of honor. It was as if the weight of the game was no longer about pride against another nation. It was about proving that kindness and respect could survive under pressure. The Indian captain walked up to his young bowler, placing a hand on his shoulder. The bowler's heart was racing. This was the moment he had dreamed about since childhood, but also the moment that could break him. The captain spoke softly. "No matter what happens, remember this: play with respect. Win with grace, lose with dignity. Today, the world is watching more than cricket." The bowler nodded, his eyes wide but steady. The Pakistani batsmen at the crease were also whispering to each other. The senior player told the younger one, "This is not just about us. Look around. The people are cheering together. The leaders are silent together. Let us play as if we are carrying not rivalry but unity." The younger batsman, barely 22, nodded. His lips trembled, but he found strength in the words. The bowler began his run. The entire stadium stood on its feet. Millions watching on television leaned forward. The ball was released. It flew fast and sharp. The batsman swung with power, the ball racing toward the boundary. But then, almost like fate testing the crowd, an Indian fielder sprinted with all his strength. He dived, stretched his arms, and caught the ball just before it touched the ground. The crowd gasped. It was out. In any other match, such a moment would have brought anger from one side, cheers from the other. But here something remarkable happened. Yes, there was noise, but it was not divided. It was one sound, one applause, one respect for courage. The Pakistani batsman who had been caught walked off slowly. But instead of bowing his head in shame, he raised his bat toward the applauding crowd. And the Indian fans clapped even louder, showing him he had played with dignity. Sitting in the stands, Modi's lips curved into the faintest smile. He did not need to speak. The moment was already speaking louder than any leader ever could. Sundar Pichai looked at the crowd, and a thought crossed his mind. If silence can do this, imagine what respect can do in other parts of life. But the game was not finished. Pakistan still had another batsman ready, and the runs required were narrowing. The young bowler prepared again. His heart was loud in his chest. He thought of his family watching him at home, thought of the silence of the leaders, thought of the way the crowd was united. He whispered to himself, "Let my ball carry not just speed but peace." He bowled again. The batsman struck and the ball went flying into the sky. Everyone looked up. The stadium froze for a heartbeat. Would it be six or would it be caught? The ball came down fast, but this time it landed just beyond the rope. 6 runs. The Pakistani fans cheered, but even Indian fans clapped in respect. It was not just a shot. It was courage under pressure. The match grew tighter with every ball. The scoreboard showed a race that no one could predict. 10 runs required, then 7, then 5. The tension was unbearable, but it was not poisonous. It was pure. It was the kind of tension that brought people closer, not further apart. And then came the moment that would forever be remembered. With 2 runs needed from the last ball, the young Indian bowler stood ready again. Sweat dripped down his forehead. The batsman raised his bat, knowing this ball could make him a hero. The crowd was so silent it felt like the whole world had paused. The bowler ran, released, and the ball curved sharply. The batsman swung with all his power. The ball flew fast along the ground. The fielder sprinted, stretched, and stopped it just before the boundary. The batsman ran, 1 run completed. They pushed for the second. The throw came in. The wicket-keeper grabbed it and dived. The stadium exploded. The umpire's finger went up. Run out! India had won by just 1 run. The noise was thunderous, yet inside it was no anger, no hatred. It was applause from both sides. Pakistani players hugged each other, then walked to the Indian side and shook hands. The Indian players clapped for the courage of their rivals. The crowd, all mixed together, stood as one. And in the middle of it all, the cameras turned again to Modi and Pichai. They were still silent. But their silence was no longer just silence. It was the loudest message of the night. The match had ended, yet the story was just beginning. The scoreboard flashed India's narrow victory, but for the people inside the stadium and the millions watching from homes, the result felt like the least important part. What truly mattered was the way silence, respect, and kindness had shaped the night. Players from both teams walked toward each other. Normally, such matches ended with hurried handshakes, sometimes even cold gestures. But tonight was different. The Indian captain embraced the Pakistani batsman who had almost won the game. The crowd roared with approval. Other players followed, shaking hands not out of duty but out of genuine warmth. Cameras caught smiles, pats on the back, and even moments of laughter between rivals. When the teams lined up for the presentation ceremony, something remarkable happened. Instead of standing apart in 2 distant groups, they stood closer, their shoulders nearly touching. Even the announcer hesitated for a second, sensing the unity in front of him. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have seen cricket at its best. But more than that, we have seen humanity at its strongest." His voice cracked as he spoke those words, and the crowd responded with thunderous applause, but the most powerful image was still to come. As the trophy was prepared for presentation, both leaders, Modi and Pichai, were invited to the stage. The crowd expected them to speak, to deliver words that would match the moment. But when they walked up side by side, they did not rush to the microphone. Instead, they stood silently, just as they had throughout the game. The silence stretched long enough to feel heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was heavy in the way a prayer is heavy, heavy in the way truth carries its own weight. The players stood still. The crowd waited. The cameras zoomed in. And then, without a single word, Modi joined his hands in a namaste, bowing his head slightly toward both teams. Sundar Pichai simply placed his hand over his heart, his eyes soft and humble. That was all. No speeches, no promises, no slogans. Just silence. And yet that silence carried more meaning than any speech ever could. The crowd understood it. The players understood it. Millions watching from India, Pakistan, and across the world understood it. It was a message that words might have spoiled, but silence had purified. In that silence, families watching on television began to cry. In a small village in Pakistan, an old man whispered to his grandson, "Remember this, child. Respect can change enemies into brothers." In a crowded street in India, young boys playing cricket paused their game to watch the screen. And one said softly, "Maybe we don't need to fight. Maybe we just need to play." Social media exploded, but not with the usual insults or anger that often followed these matches. Instead, timelines filled with clips of players helping each other, crowds clapping together, and the leaders' silent gestures. People wrote words like peace, unity, respect. Hashtags calling for love between nations spread like wildfire. Journalists, who had come ready to write fiery headlines about rivalry and victory, found themselves lost. Their pens moved differently this time. They wrote about tears in the stands, about the child who held both flags, about the silence of two leaders who spoke without speaking. Some even admitted openly, "We came to cover a match, but we ended up covering history." And for the players, the night left scars of kindness on their hearts. The young Indian bowler who had bowled the last over sat quietly in the dressing room. His teammates cheered him, but he thought of something else. He thought of the nod of respect he had received from the senior Pakistani batsman, and he realized that moment meant more than the wicket he took. He whispered to himself, "Winning a heart is bigger than winning a match." The Pakistani batsman, who had fought bravely until the end, sat in his own dressing room. He had lost the match, but inside he felt no shame. He remembered the applause from Indian fans when he walked off. He remembered the way an Indian fielder patted his shoulder. He closed his eyes and thought, "I lost a game, but tonight I won respect I never dreamed of." And in the middle of it all, Modi and Pichai left the stadium quietly. They did not wait for interviews or celebrations. They walked through the corridor like ordinary men, their silence still unbroken. One reporter tried to shout a question, but neither responded. Instead, they gave a small smile as if to say, "You already heard what you needed to hear." That night, across borders, people struggled to sleep, not because of anger or heartbreak, but because of the weight of what they had witnessed. Silence had melted walls. Respect had crossed boundaries. Kindness had touched hearts. The night of the match faded, but its echoes refused to die. By the next morning, newspapers across India and Pakistan carried front-page images not of the winning team lifting the trophy, but of Modi and Sundar Pichai standing side by side in silence. The photos of players embracing, of the child holding both flags, of the crowd clapping together were printed everywhere. The headlines were not about victory or defeat. They were about respect. In small homes and large cities, the conversation was the same. People spoke less about the runs and the wickets, and more about the silence that had changed everything. Fathers told their sons, "Did you see how they respected each other?" Mothers told their daughters, "Did you see how leaders said more with silence than speeches?" Children drew pictures of two teams standing together instead of enemies divided. Television debates, which usually turned heated after such matches, were calmer. Anchors who once raised their voices now spoke softly. "For decades," one anchor said, "we have seen rivalry bring pain. Last night we saw rivalry bring respect. If it can happen once, it can happen again." Across the border, another anchor said, "We are used to celebrating victories with pride and losses with anger. But last night, we celebrated humanity itself." The players also felt the shift. The Indian captain received messages from Pakistani fans thanking him for helping the injured batsman. He replied with humility, saying, Respect is greater than rivalry. The Pakistani bowler who stopped running to check on the Indian fielder became a symbol of kindness, praised not only by his country, but also by people across the border. Both sides found themselves united in admiration for each other's courage. The young Indian bowler who had bowled the final over became a hero, but in his interviews he never spoke about the winning wicket. Instead, he said, "I will always remember the nod of respect I received from their senior batsman. It reminded me that cricket is not just about runs and wickets. It is about hearts." Those words spread like fire, shared on social media with millions of likes and comments. The senior Pakistani batsman also gave an interview. When asked how he felt losing by just one run, he smiled softly and said, "I may have lost the match, but I gained something greater. I gained the applause of people who were supposed to hate me. I gained respect from the other side. And that respect is more valuable than a trophy." His honesty touched millions, and his words were replayed again and again across news channels. In schools, teachers used the match as an example to teach children about humility and kindness. "Look at the leaders," they said. "They showed us that sometimes silence is stronger than noise. Sometimes respect is louder than anger." In offices, workers shared clips on their phones during breaks saying, "If they can respect each other, why can't we?" Even in markets and buses, strangers spoke more kindly than usual, as if the memory of the match had softened everyone's hearts. And far away, in the quiet homes of soldiers' families, there were tears of a different kind. Mothers who had lost their sons to rivalry whispered prayers that maybe the future could be gentler. Fathers who had seen years of conflict closed their eyes and imagined a world where their children could clap together in the same stadium without fear. But the most powerful reaction came from ordinary people on both sides of the border. Thousands began writing letters to each other, sharing them online. Indian fans wrote to Pakistani players, "We respect your courage." Pakistani fans replied to Indian players, "We admire your kindness." Hashtags of unity trended for days, breaking records. It was as if silence had become contagious. And in the middle of it all, Modi and Sundar Pichai remained silent. They gave no interviews, no long speeches. But everywhere they went, people looked at them differently. Their silence during the match had turned into a symbol. People called it the silence that spoke louder than history. Weeks later, the memory of the match still lived strong. People no longer asked only who had won or lost. They asked, "Do you remember that moment when the crowd clapped together? Do you remember the child holding both flags? Do you remember the silence of the leaders?" It became a story told in homes, classrooms, and gatherings. It became a memory carved into the hearts of millions. The rivalry between India and Pakistan did not end overnight. History could not be erased in one evening. But the silence of that night had planted a seed of respect, a seed of hope. It was a reminder that even in the loudest battles, silence could heal, respect could unite, and kindness could lead. And so the story of that night became more than cricket, more than politics, more than rivalry. It became a lesson for generations, that sometimes the strongest voice is no voice at all, and sometimes the most powerful action is the quiet act of respect.